Yeah, so I think the time has come. So we like to begin. Thank you for participating today in this keynote speech by Professor Daniel Jill in the Japan Interpretation and Translation Forum 2020. Before we begin, please note that for this English session, we are offering a simultaneous interpretation into Japanese. So the interpreting function has been turned on, and those of you on the Japanese channel should be able to hear the interpreters now. My name is Keitaro Morita of JASI, or Japan Association of Conference Interpreters, and your MC today. Since our establishment in 2015, the JASI has held a Japan Interpreting Forum every August. Given that many large-scale interpreting and translation events this year have been canceled due to COVID-19, we have decided this year to rename the event the Japan Interpretation and Translation Forum 2020, and holding it completely remotely throughout the month of August. And this is our first such attempt. You may experience some glitches throughout our program. We ask for your kind understanding as we work through our growing pains. I'd like to take a moment now just to make sure that the interpreters are being heard on the Japanese channel. Can someone on the Japanese channel raise your hand by clicking the raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen if you can hear the interpreters? Oh, thank you so much. Great. So now some housekeeping announcements. And this keynote speech is being recorded. The video will be made available to all attendees and JASI members at a later date. And this is a webinar, so all of your mics and videos have been turned off. And you are invited to ask your questions throughout the presentation via Zoom's Q&A function. You can find the Q&A box by clicking on the icon at the bottom of your screen. And the questions may be written in English or Japanese. And Professor Jill is on the English channel, just so you know. Okay, so this session, once again, is a keynote speech by Professor Daniel Jill, joining all the way from France. Many of you already know very well about Professor Jill and his works, and so please just introduce Professor Jill just briefly. So Professor Jill used to be a mathematician and a scientific and technical translator, and is a conference interpreter and a member of the AIC, or International Association of Conference Interpreters. He has PhDs in Japanese as well as in linguistics. He has held a professorship at several universities and now is a professor emeritus of, pardon my French pronunciation, Université Paris Trois Sorbonne Nouvelle, since January 2014. He has published more than 250 papers, and his 1995 book, Basic Concepts and Models for Translator and Interpreter Training, which was revised in 2009, has been translated into Japanese as 通訳翻訳訓練基本的概念とモデル. The title of his keynote speech today is The Effort Models of Interpreting, Looking Back, Looking Ahead. So without further ado, Professor Jill, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Morita. Dear colleagues, I should like to thank the Japanese Association of Conference Interpreters for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. It's a great honor indeed. 皆様、こんばんは。本日皆様とお話をする機会を賜り、JA 支配に感謝申し上げます。 日本語は相当長い間やってきたつもりなのですが、私の場合、努力が実を結ぶことはなかったようです。従いまして、英語で話しますので、どうかお許しください。President Sekine suggested that I speak about the effort models, how I view them now, and how they could be applied to practice. He added that many of you are non-academic practitioners of interpreting, that is, practicing interpreters. I will be happy to oblige, though very clearly the effort models are not the only theoretical construct that deserves attention from practitioners. Now, let me just put up the PowerPoint. That I had on. Just a second. I hope you can see it. Can you see it?
Yes, I can.
Okay, fine. So, let me start with some prehistory. I had been a technical translator and occasional liaison interpreter for about 10 years when I first encountered theory in translation and interpreting. This happened while I was studying conference interpreting at ISIT in Paris. This was during the second half of the 1970s, well, almost Edo Jidai for most of you. As many of you may know, ISIT is the temple of so-called interpretive theory, which was initially known as, and this is how I learned about it. This was the name at the time, the theory of sense, Imi no Riron. Basically, what it says is that when you translate or interpret, you do not seek linguistic equivalence to words and sentences or word groups in the source language. What you do is, if you're a translator, you read. If you're an interpreter, you listen to the relevant part of the source text or speech, and then you understand it, you extract its meaning, its sense, as they said. Then you forget, this is a very important point, you forget the linguistic structure of the source text or the source speech, and then you reformulate the meaning that you have understood on the basis of the meaning, but not on the basis of the language. I found this theory very attractive because it gave us some freedom. It told us that we did not have to worry about whether a sentence in the target text or the target speech was grammatically or lexically similar to the sentence in the source text. We only needed to make sure that the meaning was the same, and it's not quite the same thing. The theory did not say that using equivalence, automatic equivalence, was prohibited, but basically, as regards everyday words and everyday sentence structures, they told us, or the theory told us, don't worry whether the form of the language is similar, just take care of the meaning, and the words will take care of themselves. Well, intuitively, this made sense to a large extent, not always. And it certainly provided us with a welcome type of guidance, which helped avoid language interference, one language interfering with another. At this point, let me tell you about a French colleague. She was an experienced translator who worked from Japanese into French, technical translation. She was self-trained. She had never been exposed to the theory of sense or to any other theory of translation or interpreting. And once she told me that one thing that she found very difficult when translating Japanese texts into French was that she was forced to change completely the structure of the Japanese original in order to write something that was acceptable in French. I'm sure she also had to introduce some changes in the information content. For instance, you remove some politeness markers or formality markers that were relevant in Japanese and not in French. Or you would add singular and plural, or you would add some explicit logical links. But the point is that she felt very uneasy about that. Probably because she wondered whether she was faithful, quote unquote, whether she was faithful enough to the Japanese text. In other words, in my opinion, what she did was right, but she was uncomfortable about it because she did not know. She was not certain that it was right or not. I speculate that if she had been exposed to the theory of sense, she might have felt much more comfortable with the decisions she made. She might have been able to work faster, more efficiently, and perhaps in a more creative way, thanks to interpretive theory, thanks to the theory of sense. So this is one example that I wanted to start with to show how a very simple theory about which I have some reservations from the scientific viewpoint. This is one example how such a simple theory can be perhaps useful to practicing translators or interpreters. So I found this theory attractive, but I also had some issues with it because besides this fundamental principle, it made some claims which I found problematic. One of them was that between the moment the source language or the source language text or speech is understood and the moment it is reformulated in the target language, there is a stage during which you lose any memory of the linguistic form of the source text. This, in scientific terms, was a very heavy claim, and introspection by anyone and also experiments show that generally some memory, at least some memory of linguistic form, does remain in the listener's mind. So this made me a bit uneasy. The theory of sense also claimed that the difficulty of interpreting is the same, whatever language pairs are involved. Whether you translate from French into English, from German into Spanish, from Japanese into Korean, or Japanese into Hungarian, the difficulty is the same. And this contradicted claims made by experienced interpreters whose qualifications were accepted, were not challenged by anyone. What proponents of interpretive theory also said included claims such as language production into one's native language is spontaneous with no difficulties. And again, this contradicts anybody's daily experience in life in general and in the interpreting booth in particular. I can understand the reasons why proponents of interpretive theory would make these claims. But if you make them in a scientific context, not only in a didactic context, you suggest it is a theory without the caution that is generally required in research and science, then there is a risk of loss of credibility. And there was also risk of loss of credibility among interpreters who read these statements or heard about these statements and said, wait a minute, this is not in line with my daily experience in the booth, so I don't believe in it. If speaking in one's native language is effortless, when students encounter difficulties, when they seek a word or when they try to finish a sentence which they have started, and this is something that all of you know happens very frequently for a number of reasons, then students can lose self-confidence. And I have seen this happen very regularly in the classroom. And this is what I reacted to. Perhaps because I had background in mathematics and research, or perhaps because I had a critical mind, maybe too critical. But when I started teaching translation and interpreting myself, and this was, I started teaching translation, technical translation from Japanese into French in 1979, I thought I should try to do a bit better, at least by avoiding inaccuracies and avoiding excessive claims, but also perhaps by adding some elements which I thought would be useful to students. One phenomenon that I found very striking and which interpretive theory did not address was the permanent feeling of effortfulness that you have while you interpret. Sometimes it's very spontaneous, it seems very easy, but on the whole, there is a lot of effort involved, in particular in simultaneous, but not only in simultaneous. Students, and that included myself, found it difficult, or at least effortful, to produce target language speeches even in their native languages, as they could see through many hesitations, many clumsy wordings that they realized were clumsy but could not do anything about it, and even through language errors. Actually, I published a study on language degradation of students who have French as an A language on the basis of what happened in the classroom. This dates back to the 1980s. And these are hesitations and errors that they do not usually make in everyday life. Also, they missed parts in source speeches quite often, including speeches or segments of speeches when trainers or students pointed out what they missed. They realized that these were words or sometimes groups of words or clauses or sentences that did not seem particularly difficult in retrospect. And students could not understand why they missed them. This was very unsettling. And most of us students started doubting that we really mastered our working languages when we were admitted to this very highly selective program, interpreting program. We thought we had a very good command of our languages, but just a few weeks after we started the program, we started doubting. And we were even wondering whether we were becoming stupid. And I came up intuitively with a potential explanation, which was based on that feeling of effort that I felt during interpreting. Could it be that speech production and speech comprehension, even in one's native language, are not really effortless, are not really spontaneous, and do require some sort of mental energy or something, some fuel that would fuel efforts? And could it be that when speech production and speech comprehension were not functioning very well, this was the result of some kind of lack, momentary lack perhaps, of such energy? And could it be that this would be due to a competition between speech comprehension and speech production, because each of them might require the same sort of energy? If this were so, this would mean that failure to produce speech or understand speech is not necessarily linked to lack of knowledge of the relevant languages. It's not the knowledge per se, but to another factor which could perhaps be dealt with separately. I started exploring the scientific literature to see what experts about speech comprehension, speech production had to say, what they had found, what theories they had. And I found very interesting theories. But before we go into that, let me just complete the presentation of my very first effort model for simultaneous interpreting, which was formulated, I think, in the very early 1980s, just very shortly after I started teaching interpreting as well. The idea is that besides listening and speaking, which are obvious to all of you, while we interpret, there are memory operations over short periods of up to a few seconds. This is something that is known to all and quite natural, because generally you need to understand before you reformulate. And re-expressing ideas in the target language requires some time, as you have to construct new sentences. So there is some lag, and because of this lag, there is some waiting. So very short-term memory operations. But what students experienced in the classroom, and you may remember that from your time as students, and maybe you still experience that, is that once they understood something that the speaker said, they often forgot it before they could reformulate it in the target language. This was also rather mysterious. Why should one forget things that you have just heard, that you have just understood, and that are basically simple? Again, I thought of a possible answer. Perhaps short-term memory operations used the same mental energy as speech comprehension and speech production. So I combined these three efforts, these three functional efforts, into a model whereby there is speech comprehension of the source speech, speech production of the target speech, and memory operations over a short term used the same limited amount of mental energy resource. And my idea was that many errors and omissions in interpreting could be due to either excessive requirements of such energy or mismanagement of this energy. And very soon, when reading the literature, I decided to call this energy processing capacity, which was the fashion at that time. And now I like to use the term attentional resources. When I talk about mismanagement, I mean too much focusing on one function, for instance, comprehension or production or memory, to the detriment of another, which can happen at any time. Actually, I found that it happened all the time. In other words, that interpreters tended to work very close to cognitive saturation, close enough to be very vulnerable to problem triggers and to the effects of mismanagement of attentional resources. And this is what I called the tightrope hypothesis. You see, you juggle with everything that you have to do, and you're basically on a tightrope. I'm sure ladies, especially mothers, can understand this slide very well, the lower part of the slide. Since interpreters work very close to saturation, they have to juggle with the attentional resources. And let me also add, when I refer to cognitive saturation, I mean two distinct cases. One is when attentional resources, this type of energy, is actually insufficient to successfully complete the interpreting process. And another is, and I'm sure that you people who are interpreters yourselves have experienced this, sometimes you just give up on trying something because you're too tired, you're not motivated enough, the effort required is too much, whereas if you had tried very, very, very hard, you might have been able to interpret everything correctly. So these are two types of cognitive saturation. And I explored the scientific literature in cognitive psychology, and I found out that psychologists had come up quite some time before I did, unfortunately, with the idea that many mental operations, actually not only mental operations, also some physical operations, required some processing capacity or attentional resources, and that this processing capacity was limited in humans at any time, and that when two such operations were conducted at the same time, this led to a deterioration in the performance of one or another or both. Of course, not when the non-automatic operations were very easy, but from a certain level of difficulty on. So, I also found that psycholinguists considered that language production, even in one's native language, was actually a complex cognitive operation, not at all spontaneous and effortless, as was claimed when I was a student. So this was a welcome corroboration of my intuitions. I also learned from cognitive psychology that when attention needs to be divided, or processing capacity needs to be divided between two or more concurrent operations, this involves additional cost in processing capacity. This also made sense intuitively. And I added the so-called coordination component to what I called the effort models, because what they stressed was the effortfulness of interpreting. So I ended up having a model of simultaneous interpreting, which was composed of three core efforts that I explained earlier on, plus a so-called coordination effort. And the total processing capacity requirements at any time are more if there is more than one effort. So it's not 1 + 1 + 1 = 3, but maybe 1 + 1 + 1 = 2.5. But at least whenever you add an effort, when the effort is engaged in a task, you add something to the requirements. And I soon developed models for other types of interpreting, for consecutive, for sight translation, for simultaneous interpreting with text on the basis of the same logic, the same rationale. One other thing that I found in cognitive psychology is that when operations that require processing capacity are repeated often, they require less and less processing capacity. This is called automation. The word automatic and automation were taboo at ESIT at that time because it was mistaken as meaning automatic translation where you don't think. But this is not the case. In cognitive psychology, automation means that you use less and less attentional resources. This was a very interesting finding, one that could generate hope in students. Students who were suffering, who were doubting their ability to become interpreters, who were doubting their mastery of languages, who were even doubting their intelligence, they had some hope. They could understand, if they accepted the ideas in the model, that they were confronted with difficult tasks, and the tasks would become less and less difficult if they practiced a lot. So it's not if you start at the beginning of the year or midway through the course, you're still struggling very hard. That doesn't mean you have no talent, you have no gift. It means that perhaps if you continue practicing very hard, then you will eventually reach a stage where it will become much easier. I found that this construct, this theory, which obviously is just putting together some findings and some ideas and some experience from the booth and from my experience as a student, I found that the effort models of simultaneous interpreting and the effort models for other types of interpreting explain quite a number of errors, omissions, and infelicities, as well as other phenomena, such as the fact that sometimes you translate correctly a very difficult speech segment and then miss completely something that is very easy, which comes afterwards. The model also explained why certain elements in speeches, such as names, numbers, and enumerations, lists of items, triggered interpreting problems. The effort model for consecutive also provided a conceptual framework to think about various pieces of advice that were given to students by teachers about note-taking in consecutive, including what to note, in what language, how to note, when to note, etc. In particular, it suggests that systematically taking notes in the target language is not a good idea because it adds processing capacity requirements at a time where you're already under very heavy pressure because you have to listen and take notes at the same time at a speed which is determined by the speaker, not yourself. So this does not mean that taking notes in the target language is wrong. It can be a very good option in some cases, but making it a fundamental principle is a bit risky. So I will not go into that and into other implications of this initial model now. I will just refer you to the book, Basic Concepts and Models, that Dr. Morita mentioned earlier on. You will find more explanations. The automation principle also widened the horizons that could be reached using the effort models and generated some further ideas. One model associated with the effort models was the so-called gravitational model of language availability, in which the idea of automation is very important. This theory or this model postulates, among other things, that when words or sentence structures, but mostly words, are encountered repeatedly, when you either use them in production very often or listen to them and understand them. Very often, this is in a passive form. Their production and comprehension, or one and the other, become increasingly automated, which means that there are lower processing capacity requirements for comprehension or production and good chances of improved performance. And conversely, when these words and structures are not used, they become less available, and their use for interpreting gradually becomes more and more, requires gradually more and more processing capacity and time, which can result in poor interpreting performance. This is why, if you have not been using, for instance, active B language for 1 or 2 or 3 years, then even though you might have had a very, very good level of mastery of the language and were very good at interpreting into B, if you start again interpreting into B after a break of 2 years, you might find it much more difficult, much more effortful. There are also other rules which you can find in the book, which you find on the slide, but we'll not spend too much time on that now. So I found that the effort models became popular in the literature, which was unexpected, because I had developed them intuitively in the beginning, and for myself to try to understand, and for the students to try to help them. But of course, I was very happy to see their popularity. What made me even happier was the reactions I started to get from many students. When they told me that the effort models helped them be less upset when they did not perform well in class. When they told me that the models reassured them and gave them hope for future improvement in spite of sometimes severe difficulties they experienced. So all these reactions amounted to the same thing. The effort models seemed to boost the morale of the students at a time where it was under very heavy strain. The effort models gained popularity in the literature, but they also started to draw attention from some cognitive psychologists and psycholinguists. And what I found, and it's quite natural, is that cognitive scientists often sought to interpret the effort models using the language of cognitive science, as if the effort models were a cognitive model in the traditional sense of cognitive science. It's very natural, but it also led to some misunderstandings. Let me explain why, and I will do that with a metaphor. If you think of a data processing service company, or any company which takes on complex projects to be developed and completed at a client's site under time pressure. This company dispatches its employees to this site. Think of cases when such projects require several experts or many experts who work simultaneously on their computers. If we observe the overall advancement of such a project, which in this metaphor corresponds to interpreting, of course, we may find that often there is considerable slowing down of the development work, or even failure to complete this or that task satisfactorily. And if you want to understand how the employees work, it may be convenient to view them as working in teams, each having a particular function. This team has function A, the second team has function B, the third team has function C, and they all work together. In interpreting, of course, in the effort models, I call these functions listening, memory, and production. In a project involved in data processing, the expert may indeed form teams dedicated to specific functions, but they may also be organized differently. So reality does not have to be exactly the same as the metaphor. At any time, the advancement of the work of one team depends to some extent on where the other teams stand in the work, in their work. They're interdependent. In the case of interpreting, I speculated that if the development work slowed down or failed to complete this or that part of the project, this was due not to the lack of professional competence of the experts, though this might happen at times, but mostly to a common requirement for some resource which was only available in a certain amount and was shared by all employees who worked on the computers. At times, when teams work on tasks with high requirements, there is not enough of this resource to complete them. And at times, the total amount of available resources is enough, but somehow not enough is available for a particular team at a particular time, perhaps because the sharing of the resource was not very efficient. I also learned something about how computers were linked on computer networks while I was working as an interpreter, and speculated that actually this particular resource could be the available intranet or intranet bandwidth, which had to be shared by all. But in similar metaphors, it could also be the available money for each team to advance, or cars, or tools, or whatever. In the effort models, this shared resource is what I call processing capacity or attentional resources. I also learned a bit more about how projects are managed in industrial environments and learned that there are project managers who monitor the work of the teams and coordinate their progression. In the effort models, this is what I call the coordination effort. I did not look at the electronics of the networks or at the specific computer programs that members of each team use to work on the project. This is in the metaphor. In the effort models, I did not speculate on specific interactions of various parts of the brain of the interpreter, or on how the various cognitive operations could be explained in a very fine-grained way, using the most up-to-date theories and findings of cognitive psychology and psycholinguistics, or neuropsychology. I do try to keep abreast of major developments in theoretical and empirical research by cognitive scientists and check that my models are still compatible with current thought in cognitive science, but my level of modeling is functional and holistic, not fine-grained, the way cognitive scientists work. Cognitive scientists observe things at a surface, then try to develop fine-grained theories at a much, much smaller scale than functional behavior units. Then they test things in the laboratory, and generally they use non-natural tasks. The approach is very different in the effort models. I'm not criticizing the approach, which I believe has merits and has taught us a lot. But I deal with a description of natural behavioral phenomena that I hope all interpreters can identify with. And I remain in my speculations and in my analysis at this holistic level, at this behavioral level. For instance, sometimes you misunderstand some psychologist or psycholinguist or even colleagues who are into research, forget this and misunderstand short-term memory effort as meaning working memory, and the so-called coordination effort as being the executive function in cognitive psychology. But it's not the same. Even though the words are similar, the concepts are not similar. Look at, in the lower part of this slide, look at menus. There are two types of menus. The words are the same. In both cases, you have several choices. In both cases, you can choose one or the other. But we're not talking at all about the same thing. In one case, you choose what you're going to eat and pay for. In the other, you choose what what kind of instructions the computers will follow to go into a particular type of the program and select some data. So it's not at all the same thing. The effort models can still be tested at the holistic level, at this behavioral level, not at the fine-grained level, because they are holistic by nature. They are not fine-grained in nature. And as long as they're in line with current knowledge and theories in cognitive psychology, and I'm referring to things such as the effortfulness of the core efforts, to the idea that attentional resources are finite, etc., as long as these things hold and are in line with cognitive psychology, I will keep them as they are. They can be tested. They are being tested at the same holistic behavioral level. And so far, they have not been challenged. As far as I know, holistic tests have either turned up evidence that corroborated them or things that are not as clear, but have not really said the opposite. I do have to mention one experiment by Kilian Zeber from the University of Geneva, who looked at cognitive load during interpreting by measuring the diameter of the pupils of the interpreters. It's a well-known physiological indicator of cognitive level. He found that in the short extracts that his subjects interpreted in the laboratory, pupils were dilated by less than 50% of their maximum value. On this basis, he said that he found no evidence supporting the tightrope hypothesis. But for several reasons, which I will not explain now, but I have written about it and I can explain further, this rationale, this logic is very weak, and it does not really refute the tightrope hypothesis, which makes no quantitative claims as to how close to saturation interpreters tend to work, only that they work close enough to saturation to make interpreters very vulnerable. Be it as it may, at this time, I have not seen another powerful explanation, more powerful than the tightrope hypothesis, for the very numerous errors, omissions, and infelicities observed in interpreting performance. I also developed with my PhD student, Sophie Pournin, who's a sign language interpreter in Paris and who heads the sign language interpreting section or department at ESIT in Paris now, an effort model for simultaneous interpreting from a spoken language into a sign language where there are different efforts. One is online interaction with a deaf, and one is self-management in space. I'm happy to report this model is popular among teachers of sign language interpreting. I do not think it teaches them anything they do not know, but perhaps they find it convenient to think about some phenomena that they experience. Okay, how useful are the effort models for practitioners? In an MA study conducted by Frauke Kleibs in Leipzig, she found that the effort models and interpretive theory, the theory of sense, were the most popular interpreting theories among students and teachers in a rather large sample, which covered mostly Europe, but also other countries. In a more recent study that I conducted in 2019, it hasn't been published yet, but I hope it will be soon, I found similar results. It seems that what students and teachers want is simple theories that are directly related to what they experience in the classroom, not something that is complex and not something that they find difficult to relate to what they experience personally. I think that both interpretive theory and the effort models meet the criterion. Other theories, other theories such as relevance theory or Zeber's model or Moser's model or Setner's model or Mizuno's model, which is very nice and is being used for something else now, to cite just a few, are more detailed, more engaged in cognitive disciplines, but they are more complex and require the acquisition of more abstract notions. Also, they're more remote from classroom experience. Interpretive theory provides simple guidance on a very fundamental principle in translation and interpreting. It says, if you want to have best results, translate on the basis of sense, not language correspondences. The effort models do not provide such prescriptive guidance. What they do provide is a conceptual framework to explain challenges and to assess tactics and strategies. Neither directly provides new information about actual interpreting performance, but then no other interpreting theory does. Neither makes any quantitative description or prediction. Neither do other theories, except for an attempt by Kilian Zeber, who used a theory by Wickens. It's interesting, but not very convincing at this point. So this leads us to go a bit beyond the effort models. Are interpreting theories useful to practitioners beyond their use in the classroom? If they do not teach you anything useful that you do not know, if they cannot make any accurate prediction as to what happens in the booth, what can they contribute? President Sekine asked me to talk about the effort models, so I will take the liberty of talking about them first. The first potential contribution of the effort models that I should like to recall is that they help understand many challenges that we are confronted with, and they do so in a simple, unitary way, using the simple construct of limited processing capacity. The second contribution of the effort models is also, as I mentioned earlier, that they provide conceptual tools to assess the merits and drawbacks of tactics and strategies and to analyze some received ideas that may not be so good after all, if you look at them from the cognitive angle. This includes ideas on how to take notes in consecutive, or how to improve one's mastery of languages, or preferences in directionality. Perhaps such analysis will produce intellectual satisfaction, the pleasure of understanding. But is this necessary? I would not claim it is, but I do think it can lead to some changes in ideas and practices, and perhaps to some improvement of interpreting performance. Perhaps, perhaps not. Another possible use of the effort models is persuasion. If you discuss interpreting with people who believe that interpreting is only a natural consequence of knowing two languages, especially clients who do not understand the importance of briefings, of providing documents in advance, of having excellent sound, etc., the effort models are a convenient tool, or so I believe, to explain what cognitive efforts actually are involved and what difference good working conditions can make. Of course, people, and in particular clients, may not want to listen to you, but if they do, rather than take them through complex cognitive science-based explanations, it is probably more efficient to explain the effort models. Okay, in the field of translation interpreting, theories do not teach us new facts. Empirical research does. For instance, on the basis of your experience in the booth, you may want to find out if an interpreter's foreign accent influences overall quality perception. Do people think the interpreter is better or not, depending on whether he or she has a foreign accent or not? Well, surprisingly, in a very interesting experiment by Andrew Chong from Polytechnic University of Hong Kong, he found that the interpreter who sounded foreign, and who was foreign actually, but the listeners did not know that, he got better his interpretation got better quality ratings than one which was strictly the same, but which was provided by a Chinese interpreter. We may want to know whether listeners can really assess fidelity reliably. Can they or can they not? There are conflicting views about that. Empirical research may be able to tell us. What about simple exercises? You know that one of the problems of interpreting is, for instance, between Chinese and European languages, Japanese and European languages, maybe Korean and European languages. When you deal with large numbers, with man and oku, there are some exercises that have been designed by teachers, sometimes over short periods, and that are claimed to actually improve performance. Is this true or not? This is the sort of thing that empirical research can tell us about. Or is interpreting teachable when people still have not mastered the two languages well enough? There is some research on that as well. So, you may object that you do not need theories to come up with these questions, which is true. But traditionally, empirical science is presented as starting with observation. You observe the world, then you speculate, you build a theory, then you test it, then there's a new theory, etc. And the tests are the empirical research. But in interpreting, and not just in interpreting, questions also come directly from practice. So why would you need theory? Well, you don't really need theory directly, but research training includes theory. When you learn about theory, you learn how theories were developed, how they evolved, how they were adopted, rejected, modified, and this is how you learn how to think critically, how to observe critically, how to make inferences cautiously. All of this is part of science. So for researchers, learning about theory is very, very important. Okay, looking ahead, as I explained, the effort models are by design simple and holistic. These features may be major contributors to their popularity, which has been unchallenged for close to 4 decades now, just as interpretive theory has been popular for about 5 decades. During all this time, there have been major advances in cognitive science, and yet interpretive theory has remained virtually unchanged, and the effort models have only witnessed one major update. My guess is that interpretive theory will remain popular in training circles and unchanged, and the effort models, they should also remain popular, and perhaps we'll see the emergence of new versions if researchers and teachers identify new functions that are associated with major attentional resource requirements. For instance, this could be the case if in the future technology in the booth require you to manipulate screens and move from one screen to another, from one control to another, etc. Then there might be, your attention might also be engaged in man-machine interaction. Or if under certain circumstances, you need to devote a lot of attention to what you're going to say and what you're not going to say, how you're going to react, because on your decisions, and not just verbal decisions, not just interpreting decisions in the linguistic sense, if the outcome of the meeting depends to a large extent on psychological factors, sociological factors, and others, and you really have to pay attention to that, then it might make sense to add another type of effort. So, to wrap up this within the 1 hour that I have, I would not claim at all that theory is necessary for interpreting students and for practitioners. I'm not sure at all that at this time theory allows practitioners to reach better performance. If anybody claims the opposite, I'm still looking for proof. This may happen in the future if much empirical research is conducted and if the empirical research produces findings that are innovative and practice-oriented. But this need not be the case. But I think that theory as it stands, if it is selected adequately, can be useful for guidance and for explanation at very little cost for students, for trainers, and practitioners. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, so Professor Joe, so thank you so much for your wonderful presentation and also insights. Indeed, I'm not a scholar of interpretation and translation theories, but as a practitioner, I am always reminded of your models when I'm having a hard time catching up in especially simultaneously interpreting. So your models personally are really resonating with me as a practitioner. And now we like to entertain questions from the floor. So thank you so much for posting them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And those of you who have not yet, please you can start to get your questions into the Q&A box now.
Okay, I have one question in Japanese from an anonymous viewer who asked whether the manuscript will be available. My answer is that if I will provide a script, if you wish, I will prepare it. Not the PowerPoint presentation, but I will provide the script. I hope that is a satisfactory answer. That's the only question that I see in the box at this point.
Yeah. So thank you. Right now we are seeing only one question in the Q&A box. So you're welcome to get your questions into the box now.
Okay, I can see from Hiroko Kobayashi, that's one in English. She says she has two questions. First of all, she asked whether from my observation and analysis, whether I saw that the distribution of attentional resources to the three core efforts, or to the four efforts, is different between experienced interpreters and novice interpreters. Okay, so the question is, do experienced interpreters and students or young beginning interpreters manage their resources differently? Yes, I think they do, but this is only my observation and analysis. This hasn't been measured yet completely because it is very difficult to identify exactly how this distribution of attentional resources is done. You can see it on a behavioral basis. You can see when people devote too much attention to this or that. Sometimes you can ask them, what happened? Why did you make this mistake? Why do you think you made this mistake? And there is a lady, a colleague, Dr. Gumul from Poland, who has done very interesting work with students and gathered a lot of introspective reports, which you might like to look at. So you know, from sometimes the younger ones, the students say, I put too much emphasis on note-taking and then I didn't listen. well enough, and then you see more experienced professionals who don't fall into this trap. But measuring this or observing this with any kind of accuracy or certainty is still very difficult. It would be very good if we managed to do that. And so far, we might think that brain imaging techniques might help us do that, but it's very difficult, because when we do use all these brain imaging techniques to see which part of the brain is being used for this or that effort, etc., then of course it requires tasks that are highly controlled in laboratory settings, and we get quite remote from the booth. So I'm afraid it's an excellent question. It's an excellent question, but I think at this time we have an idea, and I think that any experienced teacher of interpreting has an idea of the changes that occur, but not in any accuracy. Let me respond to a related question to Ms. Kobayashi's question again. She wonders whether interpreters can manage the distributions of resources themselves. And she adds, she feels that the management of distribution of resources in herself is probably subconscious. But it is certainly partly subconscious, but it is certainly partly conscious. You know very well when you do consecutive that you now take notes, now you don't take notes, you listen, or you use the time, the little pause to read the notes again and to wonder how you're going to re-express things. And the same thing would apply in simultaneous. You are aware of the fact that sometimes you will tend to be closer to you will lag, you will take more distance from the speaker, so you can focus on the production, or you can focus on comprehension, etc. From a colleague, Mr. Sasaki, who is studying the behavior of machine translation, who's asking me about my opinion about the future of my effort model. I think the future of my effort model is the same as the future of my physical person. At one point, it will disappear. The effort model, he asks, is whether this will be applicable for machine translation. I think the effort models were designed for humans. They were not designed for machine translation. So basically, I don't think this would work, except perhaps if machine translations used on a provisional basis to do some simulation of what interpreters do in an artificial intelligence mindset. But if you go beyond that, if you use highly statistics-based algorithms and statistics-based machine learning, deep learning of neural networks, I think that the effort models are probably irrelevant. And then we have someone, oh, interesting, someone called Moshi Moshi. This is the first time I encounter this as the name of a colleague. I hope Moshi Moshi is in the phone book or in the directory. Who asks, as a self-educated interpreter, Mr. or Ms. Moshi Moshi gained new insights for further learning. He or she is wondering how the theory models are influenced by language combinations. Would there be a large difference in functionality when the combination would be either Dutch English or Japanese English? Again, the question of language specificity is something that the effort models address in the analysis. I do not think that basically you move away from the three core efforts and the coordination, but the amount of information that you may need before you start interpreting, before you understand, or before you can finish your sentence, and all the implications are definitely, in my view, are definitely language dependent, and it would make a difference when you work between Dutch and English, which are rather similar both in terms of words and in terms of grammar, or Japanese English. Then we have a question from Kayo Matsushita. Hello, Kayo. I hope you're fine. She says the interpreting industry is rapidly moving towards remote interpreting. Yes, this is called black hole physics, especially in the simultaneous mode. This requires additional efforts on the part of the interpreters, as you partly noted, using multiple devices, sending typed messages to the partner technical staff while interpreting. I'm sorry, I will read this again because it may have been a bit too fast for the interpreters. She says that remote interpreting requires additional efforts, such as because you use multiple devices at the same time, because you have to type messages to your partners or to technical staff while you're interpreting, you have to switch between screen, etc. If simultaneous interpreting has often been performed at a level of saturation to begin with, the question is, are human interpreters even capable of coping with these additional efforts? If so, which of the three core efforts do you think would need to be freed? Excellent question. I think that empirical research will give us the beginnings of an answer. I think it's very difficult to know at this point how much can be automated, how well the technology can be adapted to make the man-machine interfacing easier. What kind of practice do you think is especially useful to develop automation skill? Automation skill, it's from an anonymous colleague. I think automation comes from repeated practice. So probably, to me, the most relevant one would be interpreting. The more you interpret, the more you require automation, because there are all sorts of skills that need to be practiced, to be automated. But it would make sense for a cognitive psychologist to see whether you can actually divide these efforts into components and train the components more efficiently if you train them separately, and then they combine into something else. This is actually something that was contemplated by Moser Mercer in Geneva, and by Sylvie Lambert from Canada. But as far as I know, there has been very little research on that. Would be very interesting to know. Have you ever tried, another anonymous question, have you tried to control a resource distribution? How do you do that? I'm not sure I understand what controlling the resource distribution means. Yes, let's say, if I understand correctly the question intuitively, yes, sometimes I do tell myself, wait a minute, in this type of consecutive, I have to stop taking down notes, or here I have to focus more on the note taking. I have to absolutely to take down these notes. So I focus more on the note taking. In simultaneous, yes, sometimes I have realized, I think, that I need to hurry up with my production or slow down and wait until I understand, like I think all of us. Again, can you really measure that? It is very, very difficult. I would love research to progress until it is done, until it's possible. A comment from anonymous colleague: many of the interpreters I know and work with are already dealing with additional external factors, whether technological or social I'm interested in how these factors will affect your theories in the future. Yes, thank you for the comment. The theories will, in my view, let's say in my so-called philosophy, even though philosophy is a big word for my ideas, it all depends on the data that I get. And I'm particularly interested in retrospective data, in reports from people and how they feel about it, because I'm not sure that at this point the precise physiological measurements tell us a lot about it. So my models will probably evolve on the basis of what people say. What else? Directionality from Mari Matsumoto. Directionality. I remember reading your article applying to the effort models on directionality. I remember that the conclusion was somewhat inconclusive. Would you elaborate on that, especially focusing on peculiarities of Japanese language? I'm not sure that it may have been too fast for the interpreters, in which case I apologize, but I will try to make the answer explicit enough so that the question can be inferred from that. What our colleague Matsumoto says is that in the effort models, I analyzed directionality and I did not reach any conclusions, any very clear conclusions as to whether it was better to work into an A or into a B language. But the point is that this depends on so many factors, like the fields in which you have experience in your A language and your B language. You may have an A language, which is, for instance, I was a radio amateur. And as a radio amateur, I used mostly English. And all my knowledge, if I were to interpret the conference of radio amateurs between French and English, I would be much more at ease producing in English, even though English is my B language only, than working into French, because I have not used French as a radio amateur very much. Now, if you look at Japanese, there are also other more objective factors, such as the time at which the information arrives. There is also the fact that in Japanese, if you use personal language, expressing opinions, there's a big part at the end which can be anticipated. So it changes the information density of the sentence, and depending on what language you are working from and what language you're working into, if you have if the high density of one part of the sentence corresponds to a low density part in the other language, then it may be easier to work both ways than if you have two languages that are equally dense, so where the high density of information comes in the same places. I mean, it's all very complex. It may be far too, my answer may sound very, very complex and unclear, but definitely I think that directionality depends on your mastery of the languages and on objective features of these two languages. I know one colleague who has a C Japanese, his Japanese is a C language, but he prefers working from, let's say, from French or from German or from English into Japanese than from Japanese into English, because of these objective features of the language, like when the information comes, when things are disambiguated, etc., etc. Okay, another anonymous colleague who wonders whether this is applicable to all language combinations or not. What I mean is whether this is applicable between Indo-European languages and also between Indo-European languages and Asian languages, such as Japanese, because of grammatical differences. Yes, Some Japanese students with high capabilities still have problems or challenges in simultaneous interpreting, in particular B into A. They may be lack of predictive knowledge or skills, but if they miss the story, it is disastrous. Yes, of course, I think that the principles are the same, whatever the languages. And in that, I would agree with Seleskovich and others of the Paris School. The fundamental principles are the same. What is not the same is the cognitive constraints that apply locally at every moment, at every second, at every fraction of a second when you interpret. So depending on whether a word was understood immediately or not, whether it gave you the possibility of building a mental representation or not, depending on whether you find the right word or the right expression in the other language or not, depending on how long you have to keep your target language production in working memory before you can finish the sentence. For instance, if you work into a language which is grammatically, which has lots of grammatical dependencies, like Scandinavian, not so much Scandinavian languages, but like Finnish, like Russian, like Slavic languages, and even German to a lesser extent, then you have to keep your own sentence, the beginning of the sentence in memory so you can finish it grammatically. Well, and this would make things more difficult when working into this language. So it all depends, but it's not whether it's an Indo-European language or not. It's in my view, it's valid for all languages. Let's see. Anna Ligia Pozzetti from Italy. Do you believe that the production effort is greater depending on the language? Yes, for example, from Japanese to English, since the grammatical structure is so different, or is this not related to the structure of the language? I think the production effort is greater when, for instance, you work from a spoken language into a sign language for a very simple reason, not necessarily, but on the whole, because in the spoken language, you have many, many words, standard words that express ideas, that express objects, etc. And you do not have them in the spoken languages. You do not have them, in the sign language, whatever the sign language is, whatever national sign language we're talking about. So you have to be much more creative and you have to find a way to re-express the words. And then you may have to devote more time to production when it's more sensitive socially. And maybe you don't have all the information if you interpret into Japanese and you don't know exactly who you're talking to, or into Korean, or into other languages that are very sensitive to social situations. Production may be more difficult if the information, for instance, about singular or plural, or the past, or present or future, the information is not given in the source language, but the target language requires it. Then it is more difficult in the production is difficult, unless you have all the information, in which case it becomes easier. Do you think the effort model will be different for remote simultaneous interpreting? Yes, I think at this point it is not very different yet, but it will soon. The effort model for simultaneous will probably very soon become different, as Dr. Matsushita said in her question, because already you have to juggle with all sorts of controls, the man-machine interaction, and you have to communicate with your partner who may be distant, and you may use all sorts of things. So yes, I think there will be the efforts, some efforts will be added. But don't forget that the effort models, it's no big deal, the effort models. It's just a very simple idea where you take only one aspect of interpreting, which is only the cognitive aspect, And I'm well aware that there's the social aspects, there are psychological aspects that are related to affective issues and other issues, etc. But it's always the simple idea, what can interpreters identify as something that requires attentional resources and that will come at the expense of other tasks that also require attentional resources. So it's a very, very simple principle. And I think that the effort models will probably evolve when working conditions change and force you to focus more on this or that, and perhaps there are efforts that will disappear because part of the work will be done by the machine. I don't know. I don't know is actually the real answer to all of the questions. Any thoughts on the necessity of theoretical study classes by master's degree in interpretation? I don't think that it is necessary to study theory in master's degree in interpretation. I don't think it is necessary to study anything. I don't even think that it is necessary to study interpretation. Some interpreters are naturals, they are born. The question is not so much whether it is necessary. I think the question is how useful is it, and how useful is it as a function of how much it brings and how much it costs. It's the cost-benefit ratio. If you can select very simple theory that will not take up too much time, but will give students some explanations that they strive, or will give them some reassurance at a time where they wonder whether they will ever make it or whether they're turning into complete idiots, then I think it's worth it. If this means that you have to add, or that you have to take up 20% of the time or 30% of the time, or perhaps even 10% of the time, and require people to write papers and to learn all sorts of complex terms and abstract notions, etc., and it will not give them a lot, then I would say, forget it.
Thank you. It seems that we have one outstanding question on the Q&A box. Professor Joe, can you see the question?
Yes, I think it's one of the first one that I answered initially.
Okay.
What kind of practice do you think is especially useful to develop automation skills? And I said I thought it was interpreting per se, but perhaps component skills could be more efficient. But empirical research is required to provide answers to that if a clear answer is provided. We don't know that.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think we have 3 minutes to go, so it looks like we may have just enough time for one last question.
Well, I have a question. How clear was the talk? If anyone wants to say, let's say, type from -5 to +5. I see someone is very generous, says +5. Maybe it's me posing as an anonymous. Oh, another one. I felt that some of my answers were too fast and too complex. So if you want some after-sales service, I'll be happy to answer by email or in other ways if you wish me to clarify things.
Thank you. So I think, unfortunately, the time has come, so we need to wrap up now. We really had a big turnout today. We had almost 200 participants on this Zoom keynote speech by Professor Jill. So thank you very much once again, Professor Jill, for delivering your wonderful keynote speech today and kindly taking all questions, joining all the way from France. And also thank you also to our attendees for your active participation and questions. And of course, we should not forget our volunteer interpreters, Dr. Rika Yoshida and Mr. Masaharu Kanza. So last but not least, please just give Professor Joe a round of virtual applause to him, please. And Professor Joe, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I should like to thank the interpreters very much and my apologies for having made them suffer. I will avoid coming to Japan for the next 5 years, just in case I put myself in jeopardy. Thank you so much.
Very much. Yeah, the session is adjourned. So thank you and have a great night.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.